first on the agenda is we're meeting with some of our state representatives to discuss the decision on PFAS contamination issues with the state, that they've changed, lowered the standards. Welcome. Why don't you guys all come up to the table, grab a microphone. Thanks for coming in.
I have about 80 or 100 pages here to share with you. Last summer, May and June of 2018, we were forced to shut down the fire training area, as Commissioner St. James is well familiar. 14 parts per trillion was the level set then. Oh, it's so dangerous, we've got to shut it down. And so I asked to do some research, and I give you some of my correspondence here I had with the commissioner, and he did hook me up with the EPA study that this was based on. And so I read all 50-odd pages of this study, and there's also several comments in it by some of the reviewers that this was based upon rodent studies and not human studies. The human studies that they did use were very inconsistent, and there's a lot of criticism by the reviewers on the human impact studies of how, you know, it was so variable that no conclusions could be drawn. And so I talked today with a Dr. Ali. So anyway, in January of 2019, there were two laws that enabled the DES to set the level. And they have come up with a level that was even lower than the 14, or the 7 parts per trillion, which, as I maintain, a few years ago, you couldn't measure parts per trillion.
The EPA was 70, right?
Yep. And
that's what the state was utilizing?
they were doing 70, and then they're saying, oh, maybe it should be lower, and they're coming down to ridiculous amounts that don't make any sense to me. It's like a few drops in a swimming pool. I mean, so now you have the technology to measure this. I have a lot of doubts. I mean, I do have a scientific background, and I am familiar with junk science, and I am familiar, and I have an article in here that was in The Economist about publish and don't be damned, and how they've changed the levels and the way things used to be done. When I was studying all these things in the 60s, if you come up with a new conclusion scientifically, it's almost invalid until 3 or 4 other people reproduce your experiment exactly as you describe and come up with the same results. If they come up with different results, yours has no credibility. And you know, all these things we hear about, like perpetual motion and all these kind of things that somebody will say, oh, I can clone human beings, and then somebody else looks at it and says, no, your experiment is faulty. So some of the comments are in this 60 pages that they talk about, and I've highlighted some of them. And you know, the thing that I say here basically at the beginning of my remarks is it's a family of compounds that includes PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. Compounds are very stable, so they persist in our environment with minimal degradation and breakdown. In the decades of their use, they become very widespread. Even people and animals in areas as remote as the polar regions will have detectable amounts of the PFAS in their blood. So even polar bears and dolphins have some PFA in their blood. The compounds were useful in coating objects in order to be water, oil, and stain repellent. They were applied to clothing, rugs, food handling equipment, all the way from Teflon coatings to food wrapping paper and boxes, and paint and other coatings that need to resist water absorption. This widespread use and the stability, you could take the piece of paper that's got the PFOA and you could burn it. Okay, we'll destroy it. The PFOA persists and goes up in the air, settles out on the grass. Maybe the cattle eat it or something else that you eat then again. And supposedly 60% of this comes from our food, and about 25% comes from the water we drink. So again, this is kind of an exaggeration of the threat. And so I asked him to give me references. He's supposed to send them to me. He hasn't sent them to me yet. Another thing that's happened is, in the 20 years since they decided this was a hazard, the levels of it in human blood have reduced 60% and 80% just by eventually some of it comes out of your body if it doesn't keep getting added in. So I make a remark in here, maybe this is one of the things that will take care of itself, rather than us spending millions that we don't have to go and filter all this water and set up all these things. Some of the things that remarks in here work best are these powdered activated charcoal. And so you'd have to have this fluid bed, you'd have to run all the water through it, and then what do you do with the activated charcoal, which has now absorbed this PFOA? So you've got to find a place to dispose of that where the stuff won't leach out and eventually end up back in the water again. So this is a very complicated thing. They haven't come out with very good, in my mind, system of how we adjust to it and what we're supposed to do about it. So I think barring that, I mean, I would volunteer to have my blood tested, and it would probably be far more than however many parts per trillion they decide. And supposedly the movie I watched about Parkersburg, West Virginia, where this all came about from, they found that, you know, there were high levels in some people, and that didn't affect their health at all. Others had much lower level and did have health problems. And so the other thing that was significant was that this PFOA, there was only one guy that was kind of the feature guy, and his mother was working in the room where they were dumping this stuff down the drain, and she was handling it 40 hours a day. And so he was born with a funny eye and one nostril, and he had these operations all his life till he was mature, and then finally he looked somewhat normal, and then he was scared to death because he still had high PFOAs. And the other thing that was that I think was significant is that I'm trying to remember what the 30, there was a 30 number there that now I forget. But anyway, he had a son, and his son was normal, even though we feared that everybody in Parkersburg, West Virginia, thought, oh, this is. So much of the evidence is in this one small valley. Now there could be other things in that valley that are in the soil or in the air that have more effect on those people than the PFOA. So I don't know, they've spent a lot of money there and given a lot of health awards, and even in that instance, there's not that many people affected. It's a very small number. So to pour millions of dollars into filtrations, in my mind, and one of these things in here say this could either be, it could make a difference of one cancer case in 100,000 or one cancer case in 1 million. Okay. It's somewhere in that range.
I guess we had, part of our concerns and discussions that we've had is how these new rules were adopted. We've been told that they were adopted without any input from anybody. Do you know anything about that?
That's a
and whether or not that, I mean, has that been challenged by anybody? Is that legitimate that they have the authority to do that? Maybe you can expound on that a little bit.
Rules supposedly are reviewed by the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. Rules have a life of like 10 years, and then they have to be renewed. Some agencies have expired rules, and you don't even know it. And some people, they're going out and giving fines based upon an expired rule, and it's not obvious that the rule is expired. So, and if this group, which we call GELCAR, decides we don't like your rule, they can come back in 90 days or 30 days and say, okay, here's what we've done to change to try to satisfy you. I remember one that I was invited to for a friend of mine that was on the psychiatric board, and she was upset at the fact that most of the psychiatric board had no psychiatrist. She was the only psychiatrist on the psychiatric board, and it was just a fluke that she got the appointment. And so she thought it should be changed. And so they agreed with her at GELCAR, and in 3 meetings, the majority of the board refused to change the law, or the rule. So we had to put in a law to change the rule, which makes no sense. So this all takes like 2 years to get something fixed. Yes, you're right. There is no good control of the rules. There is no good time on the input. Sometimes you're invited, sometimes you're not. Sometimes they do this with no public hearing. Or if it is, it's not well advertised. So yes, there's a lot of problems with this rulemaking.
Just for clarification, Representative Marks,
Might need to pull the mic a little.
Joe Carr's joint legislative committee, for rules, and it's made up of 5 state representatives and 5 state senators. It's currently chaired by John Reagan on the Senate side.
I'm not either.
The representative from Gorham chairs it from,
I have to pull that closer.
Representative from Gorham chairs it from the state representative side. And in order for them to make a rule, it has to be presented to them from a certain department or administration. So the Department of Environmental Services, after years of evaluation, proposed to them these new standards, gave them their reasons. This was all done in public. And then this particular PFAS, PFOA decision did come down from Jelcar.
So are they obligated to take input from the public, or no? They get a recommendation from a department and they can decide whether or not the rules should be changed?
That's accurate, yeah.
Okay, they
They're
don't,
not obligated, to be clear, the Department of Environmental Services has a public comment period. That is a mandatory.
so the Department of, so DES, while they were formulating these new guidelines, had public input?
A public comment period.
Okay, and then after that, they presented it to this other board
To Jelcar.
to adopt it?
Correct.
And then they chose to adopt it, and then under no obligation at that point to take public comment.
Further public comment is not required during the Jelcar process.
So can I ask, if you're saying Jelcar's statutory role is to review rules,
They
can
have no veto power.
can they make rules, as they clearly did in this one? It wasn't a review, it was
Jelcar doesn't make the rules, the department makes the rules. The rules are supposed to be enabled by the law, and they should look at the statutes when they make the law. But there have been instances where they did the reversal. There was one instance, and I was involved with this because I knew the rep. She had a bakery, and she was basically one or two people in the bakery. And they were gonna put in a law that someone had to go through 40 hours of hygiene training to work in a food business. And she said, I don't have time for that, and I only have one other person. This is unreasonable for a 1 or 2 person shop to have this 40 hours. It shouldn't be in the law. It should only be if you have a larger staff. And they sort of agreed to that. And then she turns around and she goes and opens a bakery, and someone from the Salem Health Board comes in and says, who's gonna go to this training? She says, no, that doesn't apply. I've only got myself here, and one other person fills in for me. And they said, well, here it is in the rules. They call in the people from HHS and said, why did you do this? We said it was unreasonable for a small well, we thought you wanted us to put it in rules rather than law. And, this was actually the opposite of what the conversation was when it was proposed for laws. So there's a lot of problems with this system, and through the years I've pushed to have it changed, and nothing changes because there's so many moving parts to it. But one of the things that we discovered when I was at ALEC a week ago was there's somebody that's gonna put these rules in a more accessible form. They're doing it for a couple of other states. We're gonna try to invite them to come to New Hampshire and do it. And one of the things you will see in the law was not only the rule rather is the date it was passed and the date it expires. And there's some in there that you don't know the date they expire. So it makes sense to me that they should be more easily accessible.
So here's our predicament. Because we had the fire station, we were trying to do the right thing. DES basically said it couldn't be anything but the firefighting foam that was used on the planes. So we're like, well, we don't want people to get sick. We tried to step right up and get water filtration systems and anyone who was above the 70 parts per million threshold.
Well, I think what really happened is the state put the systems in, like 4 of them, and then they said, now you're responsible to
And
maintain
we've since
them.
installed 2 more systems.
Right.
But the maintenance alone on those, and I apologize, Rich St. Hilaire can't be here tonight, he had to go to the hospital, but he is anticipating that with this lower standard, just this year, we're gonna have to put $40,000 worth of filtration systems in other places that have been lowered. And now, over a 10-year period, we're potentially looking at $500,000 spent on this. I don't think Kingston is a outlier in this. There's many towns that are being accused of using this foam and spreading these PFOAs, and as you just said, Ken, it's on everything, from Resolve carpet cleaner to
Yep.
snack bags, and, you know.
Bag of potato chips, a Teflon pan, the rugs, the drapes.
Can I ask, just a quick question about, so the state of New Hampshire put the systems in?
Yep, they used from the MBTE funds, the settlement with the oil companies, that's what they used to put the systems in initially. And then as,
Did they admit fault?
Did whom admit fault?
Did the state, was this a grant or was this,
No, what happened was, we were experiencing a drought. We made available, the fire department for potable water. We said, if we're gonna make that available to the public, we need to test the water. Our concern was bacteria. My understanding is it went to the state, and the state said, oh, it's a fire station, let's test it for PFOAs. And so it came back with PFOAs. And then it was like, okay, we're gonna have to test wells within 1,000-foot radius. Some houses in those areas came with PFOAs, some did not. Some came in excess, I think it was 4 of them, in excess of 70 parts per trillion. The state came down. I asked the guy, what's 70 parts per trillion? He says it's like a drop in 7 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
yeah, it sounds like Clark.
And I said, okay. And some locations next to the fire station, the adjacent property was fine, and the one past that had it. Now, our concern is, so the state put those filtrations, they put them automatically on bottled water, and then on the ones that were over 70 parts per trillion, they put in a filtration system, and then they said, hey, look, now it's on your dime. You gotta maintain those systems, and then we had to do a site evaluation on the fire department, and I think the fire department itself was below the 70 parts. We put a filtration system in there anyways, but it wasn't required. So our concern is now with the standards substantially lowered. But, we're trying to work with the DES, but now we've got other places in town that there's PFOAs, and a lot of it's starting to look like, you know what, this could be individual sanitary disposal systems, meaning somebody cleans their carpet with Resolve carpet cleaner, dumps it down the drain, it leaches out into the septic system, which leaches into their well, and now they got contamination. So the assumption is being made initially, well, it's gotta be the fire department. Well, we're not so sure about that now.
No, that's fair. That's really fair. I think, sorry.
I was just gonna say, the other issue is, so we did the 1,000-foot radius and identified it. Now that they lower the standards, that is increasing 10 more, people are gonna need it, and then once those are in, we gotta go out another 750 feet radius. So it's gonna pick up even more, all on something that we don't feel is from the fire department. People self-contaminated without realizing.
I think that's fair. One of the things that's been really interesting is just next door in East Kingston, which is also in our state senate district. We have 9 towns, and unfortunately, this has been popping up in every town. It's every town, it's every county in the state, which is part of the reason why New Hampshire is kind of on that leading edge.
And most of them aren't affiliated with fire stations or in close proximity.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate.
Can you speak to the one in East Kingston a little?
East Kingston, for example, if you're all, some of y'all are familiar with the fact that it's human waste that has been spread on agricultural fields. particularly in the pediatric realm of things. We have pediatric cancer clusters all over the place, particularly on the seacoast, unfortunately. And this PFAS, PFOA thing is something that hits close to home for me. My father died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, and he does not live very far from the county firefighting facility that we've seen had some PFAS, PFOA issues for local homes. So this is something that is of concern. I'm not saying my dad died because of the firefighters, just to be clear. I'm just saying there are a lot of unknowns here, and this is something that I take really seriously. So a couple of things. US EPA has 100% determined that PFAS, PFOA concentrations of these levels, they've been working closely with New Hampshire because we've been so closely impacted with the Coakley landfill, Merrimack, and all around the state. So we have low infant birth weights. That is it is 100% connected. Cancer, particularly of the kidney variety, is directly connected to PFAS, PFOA accumulations in human bodies. Thyroid hormone disruptions, it's a pretty significant problem for someone's long-term health, directly connected to the bioaccumulation of the body. The list is not complete. I 100% agree with Representative Weiler. This is something that's being studied pretty aggressively all over the country. A couple of things that are, I think, just to put this whole thing in perspective, we were talking about MBT. New Hampshire is one of the first states in the country under Governor Sununu and Attorney General McDonald to actually launch a lawsuit against 8 of the manufacturers of PFAS and PFOA, which could very likely result in significant income for the state in order to specifically deal with the type of issues that the town of Kingston.
10 to 20 to 30 years.
What's that?
10 to 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine on that front. But you know, that's definitely one of those things. I would say that I believe that there have already been large settlements, and those did not take those 10 to 20 years, which we're all kind of accustomed to seeing play out in the legal system. I mean, those were just kind of some of the notes that I wanted to share with y'all since I heard the discussion.
I mean, I understand the merits of it, why people are trying to lower the standards, and I don't know when we jumped in front of California and New York as to be the crazy ones who go first.
Vermont actually was out there.
Oh, there you go.
It was just crazy.
But, you know, for us, this is a big logistical issue. We now potentially are looking at $40,000 that we didn't have budgeted, that is now in our lap, and it can potentially, I mean, it may be cheaper to put a water system for the entire town of Kingston in than dealing with this as it's, you know, spirals out, and now we've already admitted to the DES that we took, well, we didn't admit, we took ownership of the situation in order to expedite it for the people so that nobody was exposed to anything that could have potentially been our fault. And now this is looking us back in the face as a huge nut that we're gonna have to crack, and nobody from the state or anything, it's just kind of these new rules are dropped on us. Nobody's telling us how they're gonna be implemented, what the standards of accountability are gonna be, or any of that stuff, and we're just kind of sitting here like, well, what do we do?
Well, one of the positive things, and thank you for inviting us all to be here, is that you have a team that's very dedicated to this community and making sure that we address some of those issues. I'm not gonna tell you that I'm gonna fix all the problems overnight, but now that I know exactly what is going on here with the situation, your concerns, you know, Representative Pearson, Representative Weiler, and I have worked together before. I haven't had the opportunity to Salem, for Merrimack, and for other communities in the southern tier of the state. But we'll make sure that we address this. I'm just gonna need to probably be interacting with all of you a little bit more than I have been.
What it comes down to is the town tried to do the right thing for the residents and with the state holding, hand in hand to put in these systems. Then, once the state put in the system, it becomes an unfunded mandate because it's like, oh, now you gotta maintain them. And, oh, by the way, those wells that were within range last week are now no longer in range. And I guess my question is, going back to the jail car, under what authority do 10 legislators get to dictate to the rest of the state without any public comment is it really legal and binding that 5 senators and 5 state reps can sit there and dictate to the state lowering to the strictest standards in the country?
They're just reviewing it. They don't really have any input.
Yeah, you're right. They can approve, not approve, or object. But that's it. That's all they can do.
That's all they can do.
Yeah, so it's basically DES is the
So-
one who said, this is what we want for the new standard.
Yeah.
We expect you to adopt it, and they said, okay.
And here's the public comment that came along, public comments that came along with it during that period.
With your encouragement, September 7th, we can start filing bills. One of the things that I would think of would be to delay the implementation. We can do that by law and say, we need further study on this, we need further information, this is rather sudden, you have lowered it from the 70, this is a shock to the system, we all have to get ready for it, we have to find a way to fund it, and meanwhile, let's put it in the state budget. Now, we already have a huge amount of state revolving funds for towns and cities that want to put in a sewage treatment plant, a water system for potable water. There's already these state revolving funds, but you got to pay them back. And so, yeah, we could put in a water system, and we could put it over a 20-year life or something like that, and we could get some break on the state revolving funds, because it ends up you don't pay the whole thing back because of extra money coming from the feds and so on. But I feel this is a little sudden, especially from, I will leave my book with you that you can all study if you want and see what this report said and some of the some of the.
Can I jump in here?
Sure.
I chaired for 2 years the commission to study environmentally triggered chronic illness. That was my commission. And one of the things I kept insisting on was, please, scientists, give us facts. Too often they came to my commission and finessed. I'm not saying they were bad people, not at all, but show me the studies. Show me why 70 is no longer a good number, but 40 is. Epidemiologically, and I had an epidemiologist work with this, show me how many lives are saved. I mean, we could say, selectmen, put 4 firefighters around the clock in the substation right around the corner from my medical center, and maybe in 25 years it would save 1 life if you did. Do the money on that. I mean, I'm wanting to know, and I kept asking this question, show me in the studies why lowering 70 parts to 40 parts to 20 parts makes how much of a difference. The other thing I kept asking, and I grew up in Leominster, Mass, and believe me, petrochemical town with all the stuff we had floating around in there, we found that there were certain nasty sounding chemicals in our town where there was no causative link to certain illnesses. We also found some that were. And as Massachusetts rolled in there in the 1960s and 70s as one of the first environmental impact invasions, we found that costs an awful lot of money to eliminate a certain chemical that has no proven negative outcome. We wanted the ones where there was proof, but show me the proof. One of the members of my commission is Clark Fraser, who's the assistant commissioner at DES, and I called him this afternoon, and we spent about a half an hour on the phone. And I said, send me some of the studies. I haven't had a chance to plow through the studies. My wife wants to look at them. As you know, she's a doctor. But one of the studies, and I printed the initial part of it on the back, a transgenerational toxikinetic model and so on. If you look down to the, next to the last two lines, it talks about potential adverse health effects. And what I kept hearing in my commission is, we don't think that these chemicals are very good for people, but that hasn't risen really to the level, in my mind, of scientific proof of causation. Now, maybe in 3 years, the studies will be there. We in Leominster in the 1960s saw that in certain parts of town near chemical factories, there were certain problems, but when the studies were done, it wasn't always a cause and effect. There's a wonderful story that somebody brought to my commission about a town out in the Midwest, and there was a certain kind of birth defect that was prevalent significantly more than normal. And so everybody blamed the chemical company. When they finally did the studies, they discovered the chemical company wasn't to blame. It was a certain something they were using to wash glass Coca-Cola bottles. So they were about ready to shut the chemical plant down when it didn't cause the problem. So I guess what I'm saying is a delay. If we can say to Gelcar, if we can say to DES, you may well be onto something. But until we have enough proof, first of all, that there is a causation, and secondly, that lowering it to, well, how many parts per billion is wise, we may be spending an awful lot of money needlessly. So that's my experience of chairing the commission for 2 years. We may be onto something, but I don't think we're there yet.
I don't know, I think we're gonna find that, when you start, if all of a sudden there was a statewide testing of all private wells, I think you're gonna find a lot of them are probably contaminated with that, and they're nowhere near a fire department. It's just because the chemicals, when you have private wells and private disposal septic systems, and you're disposing of those chemicals, it's typically people either dumping them in the backyard or it goes down the drain, clean your rugs or your furniture, or you spray waterproofing on your boots, and you know, we're gonna find that a lot of people have contaminated their own wells.
And beyond just a municipality, I mean, a taxpayer trying to sell their home, now all of a sudden we have this standard in place and they can't sell their house until they have to put a $3,000, $4,000 system to treat the water in there. I mean, that's gonna have a pretty severe effect on things.
I think we should,
Systems can't, I mean, I have a system at my house. Following my father's death, it was one of those things I was like, I just don't wanna take any chances. It was $400. It's under the sink. You put it in.
Yeah, well, the DES doesn't recommend that. They recommend it.
This is actually one of those. This is actually one of the systems. It's reverse osmosis. It's under the sink. You change your own filters.
Well,
these are for your home tap drinking water, not your whole house.
I understand that. The DES, I believe, was not, they weren't satisfied with that. You had to treat all the water that comes into the house.
You are correct, it's in the RSA, I asked.
Not just
That
the
is,
faucet you're drinking out of.
it is a $4,000 system.
you know,
I think
I would
we were
like
at
to
like
see.
3,200 is what the last two that we put in, and
And again, you know what, I mean, we tried to step up, because we didn't think the problem was of the magnitude that it may turn into, but it's gonna probably come down to, okay, you demonstrate to us that it was definitely the fire department,
Yeah,
okay, which,
yeah.
that hasn't been determined at this point.
Something else I'd like to see, especially for firemen, is to be tested on how much is in your blood. I'm willing to say how much is in my blood. What health effects has it had on me? not doing too bad at 77. So, you know, if I have I'm bound to have more than 70 parts per trillion if they can test that minute. And, okay, so what has it done to me? Show me what the harm has been. And I think we ought to have some widespread testing, as I say, especially for firemen, and look at what the health problems with firemen. Now, most of it's from what's in the smoke, but you're wearing that uniform that's been sprayed to keep the water from soaking into it.
I gotta be honest with you, Representative Weiler, I'm more concerned not for my trade, the fact I have 2 dogs and I clean my carpets all the time with Resolve. That's what I'm concerned with, because the chemical makeup has changed a little bit, but I'm gonna say 5 years ago, that 22-ounce bottle had 18 ounces of pure Teflon. You know, that's what I'm more concerned with, is what did I do to my own drinking water?
Yep, so there's a lot of things that I think need to be looked at. I think that the DES needs to make a better sale pitch to all of us. If you're gonna expect all the taxpayers in this town to spend a certain percentage of the tax basis on water treatment that, as we point out, may or may not make any difference. You know, it's just like people that wanna get rid of carbon fuels. To what extent? What can we prove? I mean, carbon dioxide, we drive down the same road for years, suddenly all the leaves on the trees are thicker. The sides of the roads have more vegetation on it, and my garden is doing a lot better. Carbon dioxide in the air. Why are we treating it like it's poison and it's like it's something terrible? I think it's an improvement. And I've read pieces, and I can bring them in that show you the positive effects of carbon dioxide, but the media, heading for socialism, all they want to do is bring more government control in.
Well, on the point of use systems for New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, this is where I was getting this from, because I've heard this speech from Clark Frazee so many times. But point of use, whole house filtration, they're all recommended options from DES. It's available up on their website, and it's available through.
You are absolutely correct. Clark Frazee does expound upon that. And then when it is a responsibility
Of the town. Or with a liability issue. Yeah.
Could I ask the select board if you've been in touch with select boards in other towns that are facing somewhat similar things? That's a lead-in to ask the question, if we were to put a bill in delaying these things for 2 years until we could really do a study and have a hearing, do you think there'd be more than just the town of Kingston jumping in with us?
We know Lebanon is having a huge issue, and I read an article, and that's what I forwarded to the select board. Stratham. Greenland.
I think Greenland was refusing to do any testing, weren't they?
I believe so.
At $300 a whack, why would they? I mean, that's the other part of this. So beyond just the filtration systems, you know, we've had an engineering firm come in and you know, do the tests around the fire station and do this 1,000-yard plume, and that was $75,000. I think it's gonna be at the end. And, you know, there's just more and more costs that, you know, we don't have a big bag of money that we can just grab from, so it's just gonna get passed on to the taxpayers, you know, and that, there are already a lot of people that struggle to pay their taxes in this town. People who are retired or low-income people that cannot afford to live in Kingston, and I see more and more people get forced out, and this has a very strong potential to be an issue that jacks people's taxes up beyond where they can afford them.
And for an education purpose, we started putting in filtration systems with one company that the state recommended.
Epping or Epping-Well and Pump, or which one?
No, it was,
Advanced radon mitigation.
Advanced?
Been using.
yeah. And then we went to put in one at the fire station, and someone came in with a cheaper bid, I won't name them, okay? And we went with it. And then to come to find out, they weren't doing it accurately, because they put in you have to test the whole water, every chemical makeup in the water, because when you put the filter in, how the water comes in, the filter's gonna take the iron and calcium, sodium, everything first, and once the filter gets clogged, the Teflon or the PFAS is gonna float right through it.
Yeah.
So you have to look at the whole, you have to build a system specific to that water, and I'm sure Mr. Prescott is well aware of that. okay?
Tell him, he'll do it.
You can't just put in one size fits all. You have to test the water and it has to be changed accordingly, because once the filters, whatever you're using as a filtration system, whether it's charcoal or whatever, you know, certain contaminants gonna stick and it's gonna bypass other things.
Yeah.
And we learned that the hard way.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all.
And PFOA is very difficult to filter.
Yeah, it's gonna go, yeah.
Powdered activated carbon seems to be the most effective.
I have a quick question for Counselor Prescott. So the gentleman from EPA, I asked him some questions when he came in and gave a presentation to try to make that distinction. Is it coming?
This is pertaining to the,
PFOAs.
was it from the barrel factory?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So when we had a meeting with him, and he alluded to the fact that it could be coming from someone's septic system as well. And I asked the question about, well, is there a certain test you can take to test that individual's water? And one of the things was caffeine, to see if caffeine is in that water test. And I don't remember what the other item was. Do you remember what the second thing that they tested for? I'm sorry?
Artificial sweeteners.
Artificial sweeteners. Thank you.
Makeup products.
So,
for several.
in your business, do you know that if we actually tested someone's well, and okay, there were PFOAs in it, but if we also came up with caffeine and artificial sweeteners, what the EPA advised me was that there's a good chance that that came from their own septic system, because that's how that caffeine and artificial sweeteners got into that septic system.
Only place it could come from.
The only place it could come from. So I was looking for some kind of a distinction to tell, is there a test we can take to see if it's created by firefighting foam, or is there a way to tell if it's coming from your septic system? And he gave those two examples. So have you ever tested anything like that, or in that manner that you know would be?
No, and I did speak to the Assistant DES Commissioner, Clark Frizey, and he had not heard of such a thing. And we discussed this because of the situation with the farm in East Kingston, where they were asked to do what the town was asked to do, supply all of the whole house treatment and start doing the monitoring wells. And his company is bankrupt and doesn't have any money to do that. And so I had a lot of interaction with that situation, and therefore I was talking like every day with Clark Frizey about this subject matter. And I'm concerned, very concerned about the expenses to anyone that gets labeled as a generator. And that's where the RSA kicks in. It says, you need to put in whole house, you need to do proper testing. And now when they're talking about testing, they're talking about approximately 4 times a year, maybe more, at the initial startup. And you know that each test is a couple $100.
$300 a pop.
Yeah, I think we got it down to 275 because we're buying in bulk, but.
Right. And then they want a treated sample as well as a untreated sample. And then when they have the system that's recommended, which is you have one tank, then a second tank, which is your firewall to the first tank breaking through. I don't know if they might even ask for a third sample a number of times a year. It ends up being that a typical system would be the cost of 1 year's testing for the first year. So it's not just purchasing the whole house equipment, it is in addition to that,
Maintaining and testing it.
maintaining and testing. And then, you know, the replacement is pretty much the same price as an installation, because it is all the granular activated carbon that is used, and it's 7 cubic feet. You
What
wouldn't
did
just replace
DES,
one.
what did they do with the East Kingston situation? Did they put in treatment in all those homes?
He did. He took money out of his retirement account, his personal retirement account, and did,
Oh, the owner of the property.
before he was instructed by DES how to do it or what to do, he purchased a number of systems which ended up not being approved. He was trying to be proactive for the whole house. It was a very difficult situation in East Kingston. And ultimately it ended with, I can't follow the rule of law. My corporation doesn't have the money, and it ended there. That's where the impasse is today.
I think a delay would be a good idea until we can to see more blood testing of the population. I'm willing to volunteer, and I think thousands of people would, just out of curiosity, especially ones that maybe have cancer and wonder where it came from.
I think that's what this board is asking, is at the very least a delay.
That's what my bill will do.
Co-sponsor.
Co-sponsors are right here.
Yep.
And if you talk to any other selectmen that want to send us letters saying they support it,
That would be helpful from other towns, because it's a state problem, not just right here. And so if you know people in, I think you mentioned Lebanon and Greenland, and if they could,
Stratham as well.
okay, Stratham as well, then it would be good to get sponsors wider afield.
Yeah, I think definitely that, you know, it's one thing if it is determined that is the source. But I don't think we can, the way it's popping up in a lot of different places, you know, it'll bypass one property and then be in another, which is, you know, if it was just going with the flow of the groundwater, you'd think anything downstream would.
this EPA report says 60% comes from the food we eat.
Yeah, and we ran into that next door. So this is way outside the plume or whatever you wanna call it, and they had numbers that were through the roof. So
And
we
it's
made
up
it-
gradient of the
Yeah,
water
it's
flow.
up, gradient.
It's in
We
the
immediately
air.
get them bottled water, we get a system put in there. Well, then upon further analysis, it's a completely different PFAS chemical than what the firefighting foam would be. And, you know, because we had an engineering firm on staff, you know, they could tell us that, but, you know, as you said, Mr. Prescott, it's, to be labeled a generator, where does that stop? You know, how far are you gonna be held accountable beyond where you potentially generated that contamination from? It's concerning.
So if there's one overarching issue, really, it's the need to determine the liability of the town of Kingston as a result of the firefighting foam. That's the major, most significant issue that we have to.
That's a big concern.
And then the second would be the cost. If it's reasonable that there are abilities to have a.
The cost to the town.
No, cost, yeah, cost of the town, correct. If it's reasonable to say that, like you were mentioning, it's very easy to treat. and I'm
Point of
sure that-
use as opposed,
Yes.
yeah.
I'm sure that was the discussion during the promulgating of the law that recently passed, to lower it down to 70 trillion. It wasn't gonna cost a lot of money to have a point-of-use system put in. This is not the case. When you become a generator, the RSA specifically says whole house treatment.
Right.
And then add the testing. It's not as simple as testing for iron, which you would
course.
necessarily, you know, 12 cents, whatever it would be.
And what is the provable benefit if we do this?
And that's the third thing. Yes, it's not as important as the, you know, the overarching, where is this coming from, who's generating it, and then how much is it gonna cost to the generator?
We shut down our firefighting training facility here in Rockingham County, yet the fire academy up in Concord is still running.
With even more PFOAs.
Absolutely.
I should add the final thing to it would be that once you determine that, you know, you have a generator and you need it tested, then you get to how can you prove prove that the generator is responsible. There's a lot of cost involved there. That's all of your monitoring wells and all of the engineering services that you paid for. We have, because of some lawsuits that we've won in the past, the funds that will treat MTBE. You know, if you have a problem in your wells and MTBE, it comes from a fund that was initially funded by the Exxon Mobil lawsuit, and we put it there to take care of future problems, because they are expensive. I believe that you should consider, when you're promulgating a law, to say that, why don't we put in seed money into this fund to take care of these extreme cases where a corporation has no money to take care of, even if they're proven to be a generator. This corporation doesn't have any money. They should ultimately be liable, or we need to go to a seed money fund that is going to be linked to be filled by a future lawsuit, or the lawsuit we just the state just enrolled into, that it would be funded. So we may be deficit spending for a while, but eventually, I believe, would be filled back up again when the lawsuit is done, and that any money that has been spent can go to the general fund. That's where it came from. It can go back to the taxpayers once the lawsuit is complete. So, there you go.
So that's the way we propose to proceed. I'm waiting for Dr. Ali to send me the links. I'm gonna leave you with my book here with what I had from last year. You can look that over and see what some of the conclusions I come to. And, when I get the new ones, I'll come to a future meeting and give you a rundown of what they're relying on and what my take is of how provable it is that any of this is coming from, where they say it's coming from, and how dangerous PFOA. One of the significant things is here, since '99, these things within our atmosphere and in our blood have declined 60% because they stopped manufacturing or they cut way back. And so there's been less PFOA put in our economy, if you will. So eventually, some of this stuff leaves your body. Not all of it, but a heavy buildup is likely to decrease. So time is a way to fix a lot of things. And I'm hoping that's the situation. So that's why I think a 2-year delay might be a good thing and people might support it.
Anybody got anything else?
Thank you very much for coming in.
Really appreciate it. It's been informative, and we gladly accept any assistance you can give us in trying to address this issue on the state level.
Thank you, gentlemen, for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please put in the record that I was excused from being late because I had to work.
Give all these details.
August 12th, with the correction that it be the meeting of August 12th on the top of the minutes,
July 12th.
not July 12th, and that the previous correction that Selectman Briggs made regarding who motioned and who seconded.
Second.